Uh,
Okay, welcome friends, wherever you are. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever. On behalf of the Department of English, University of Gurbango, this is Amit Bhattacharya, your host for the session, welcoming you to the fourth lecture of Parley 2021. Today, we are very happy to have in our midst Dr. Andrea Sau. He is actually he is professionally associated with the St. Mary's University. He teaches politics and international relations over there. Now, Andrea actually teaches political economy, security studies, international relations, ideological studies, and so on and so forth. Today, he has given his gracious consent to talk about a very, very interesting thing. You know, Marx's theory of historical materialism, and he is actually talking about it as a holistic framework. Now, even though Marx had enunciated his theory of historical materialism all those years ago, it is still relevant. And because Andrea has researched thoroughly the writings of Marx and Gramsci, I think he will bring very new things to the intellectual feast. So without further ado, let me now request Andrea Sau to address us. So it's over to you, Andrea.
Hello. Hi. I'm Andrea Sau, and so I'm originally from Italy, but I've been living in London for 15 years now. So maybe my accent will sound very weird to you. And as Amit said, my my focus, or the focus of my research, is the writings of Marx and Antonio Gramsci, and in particular the concept of ideology. That my research, my PhD, was a theory of ideology that is based on their work. But before I could kind of figure out what ideology meant, I had to figure out what Marxism meant. So I'm gonna just start sharing the PowerPoint, because that makes it a bit easier for me. So one thing that I know about this lecture series is that it's a lecture series about essentially bringing people from different disciplines together. So the kind of general topic seems to be interdisciplinary research. And so I can tell you what my field is, but if you were to ask me what exactly my discipline is, I'm not sure myself. And why? Well, because by studying Marx, you kind of get to look at different things: political economy, social theory, political philosophy, history, and such. So it is hard to pin down exactly what my discipline is. I mean, I'll say probably in the broadest sense is philosophy, but again, because Marx has this holistic method where he doesn't see differences between, let's say, sides of social reality. So he doesn't think you should, let's say, have a specific focus on one thing without looking at something else. But I suppose this will make a bit more sense once we get into the actual content of the lecture. So here is a kind of summary of what I'll be discussing. There is a lot of material, so I might have to go quite quick, and this might be a bit, I'm not sure whether you find it a bit complex or not, but because I've been quite ambitious with this, so there is a lot of material. So the idea here is that if you look at Marx, he's considered, again, because there wasn't such a distinction at the time between the various disciplines. And in today's world, we look at Marx and we think of him as a philosopher, as a historian, as an economist, as a sociologist, and he was also a journalist. So many things. And if you look at Marx's writing, I'll see. Sorry, there is a bunch of typos here. Forget that. So if you look at Marx's writings, then he mostly was concerned with an analysis of capitalism, and then a lot of his writings were either that or journalistic writings dealing with things and issues at the time. However, there is this thing that he never really explains well. This thing called the materialist conception of history. That's what he calls it. And later on, this becomes known as historical materialism. And you see, the thing is, the historical materialism, it appears, it is very kind of popular among Marxists, but nobody knows exactly what it means. And except for something quite vague, which is that history essentially develops through economic logics. So historical development is determined by economic factors. But so this is the idea of the economy as the motor of history. Unfortunately, Marx never, I mean, arguably it does explain a bit of this, but it's never really formulated that well, because Marx really was concerned mostly with the analysis of capitalism and you know, communism at the time, and kind of political action and such. So his materialist framework is never really explained. Although what we can know by looking at his writing and how he analyzes things is that historical materialism is a holistic framework, which means that it looks at society as a whole. So the various, if you want, aspects of society, the politics, culture, art, and philosophy, from Marx, they were all interconnected, and therefore they should be studied together. And so the reason why I frame this in this way, again, coming back to interdisciplinary research, is because the way I kind of see interdisciplinary research is as being somehow open to a certain holism, in a sense that if you think that the topic of, let's say, your PhD, of your research needs some input from other disciplines, then what that means is that you're, in some sense, you are open towards a more holistic view. You're open towards seeing that, let's say you study politics, but the question you're asking, the kind of research you're trying to do really needs to some elements from, let's say, economics or sociology or cultural study and whatnot. And so I think interdisciplinary research entails this kind of openness towards a holistic framework. And so, as I said, so coming back to Marx, this is kind of the reason why I have framed this in terms of holism, right? Because I thought this was somehow relevant to how this lecture series is organized and the general topic, which is interdisciplinary research. And as I said, Marx never really write much about this historical materialism theory. And if you want, the text where it is arguably explained the best is the German ideology, although the German ideology is full of other stuff, and it's a very, very tiny portion that actually explains this method. And most of the German ideology is actually devoted to criticizing the so-called young Hegelians. And so nobody really cares about that part anymore today, but we all wanted the historical materialist part, but unfortunately it's not. It is developed to an extent, better than in other places, but it's not fully developed as you would have like proper theory. And so because this is not fully developed, then you have many, many different interpretations of historical materialism. And the kind of earliest interpretation of historical materialism reduced it as a theory whereby everything is just determined by economics. And this is the later dubbed economic reductionism or vulgar materialism, because according to this deterministic view, essentially, you don't really need to understand the politics or the culture of a place. You can just reduce them to some underlying economic factor, right? And this, of course, is a problem. And Marx himself noticed it, and Engels and lots of people after. A lot of Marxists were concerned with this problem, where how can we understand Marx and what he says without becoming reductionist, without reducing everything to economics? And then in a way, then if you reduce everything to economics, then your whole holistic framework is kind of mutilated, because everything is just boiled down to one other thing, right? And so the problem of escaping reductionism is a fundamental problem for all Marxists. If you're a Marxist, this is one of the things that you are concerned with. And so what I'm going to try to do today is just offer my own interpretation of Marx's historical materialism. And I try to essentially keep this kind of determinism without making this too reductionist, without, let's say, assuming that everything can be simply reduced to economics. And so the way I see Marxism and well, historical materialism to be more precise, it is as a theory not to predict things. It's not a theory that can tell you, well, what's going to happen because you look at the economy, and then by doing that, it tells you what everything else is. It is just a theory that helps you essentially organize your material by looking at how Marx views certain connections, right, between, and especially the connection we're going to be talking about is between the economy and other social facts or other realm of society, right? So the first part, we're going to be looking at philosophical anthropology, and then we're going to look at the relationship between history, economics, and culture through Marx's theory of the mode of production. And then we're going to look at the probably most, if you want, controversial part of the theory, which is the ideology and the base superstructure metaphor, and how this, in my view, explains the relationship between history, economics, and politics. Now, again, this I might have to go, because there is so much stuff that I want to discuss, so I might have to be speedy. Of course, later on you can ask me questions and I can develop those aspects. So the first thing you need to understand if you want to get what Marx is trying to say is so-called philosophical anthropology. So the more philosophical part. And philosophical anthropology essentially is, if you want, a branch where you discuss what you think are the key features of human beings. What are the key characteristics of human beings? What is human nature? How can you describe human nature in the abstract? What kind of characteristics do human beings have in general? And you have all sorts of theories, right? You can have people like Thomas Hobbes, who says, well, human beings are inherently egoistic and greedy, and they fight with each other. Or you can have liberal thinkers think human beings are inherently immoral and whatnot. And Marx has a different view of this, and he says, here's a quote from him: "Man can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. They themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life." And so the idea is that Marx is saying, well, look, of course, if you want to distinguish human beings from animals, there is all sorts of ways to do so. You can say that they are moral, that they have religion, and they have rationality or whatnot. However, he says they themselves, they begin to show us how they differ by creating the means of their own subsistence, by altering nature around them and creating those tools. And here, there is the core distinction then from Marx is that human beings are primarily producers. That's the kind of key feature that they have, according to Marx, right? And that's the way Engels put it. I think it's quite nice. He says the essential difference between human and animal society consists in the fact that animals at most collect while men produce. So this is the idea that what makes us different from other animals is that we, to survive, to live, we don't just go around gathering things, but we produce, we create tools, right, that allows us to fulfill our needs in different ways. And here is the idea then from Marx that what we do essentially is that we shape nature, right? By producing, we alter nature, and then by altering nature, we also alter of course, our relationship to nature, but also our relationship to one another. So it's the idea that, you know, let's say I am in a primitive society where I'm surrounded by a forest and I'm scared of animals. On the other hand, let's say that I develop and I create a village, I cut the trees and make houses and then create fences. You can see that already just by doing this, I'm creating a new relationship between me and the environment. I'm creating like a safer area, and then perhaps the relationship between me and other people might also change. So that's the idea that fundamentally we change society, we change nature through production, and by changing nature, we also change ourselves and how we relate with one another. And I will develop this in the next few slides. One thing that I wanted to mention for those of you that are interested in Marxist literature and might know a bit about the debates, because of this idea of humans as producers, arguably one thing that Marx is kind of saying is that there is not a human nature in the abstract, because human beings always change themselves by producing, right? The way in which they are, the way in which they behave, their psychology always changes because they change it themselves by producing new things and altering their relationship to nature and to each other. And so there are two ways to see this, and there is some people says that for Marx there is no human nature because of this, because human nature is always to produce, and that's the so-called anti-humanist within Marxism, the most popular being Louis Althusser. And then there is the humanists that say, no, well, this is, of course, he's saying the human beings change, that there is no maybe particularly thick psychological characteristics, but this is a conception of human nature nevertheless. So that's a kind of split, and we don't need to discuss it. This is just for those of you that are interested in to kind of see how this relates to some of the literature. I personally side with the humanists because I think this is a conception of human nature. It is not saying, because, you know, arguably saying that human beings are inherently producers and they change themselves, it is still some conception of human nature in my view. Right, so that it is covered now. Let's move on to the mode of production. And so what is the mode of production? It is probably one of the most popular parts of Marxist theory. He talks about this thing called the mode of production, what exactly the mode of production contains and how it should be conceptualized. Marxists agree to some extent, but not exactly. I will get to where I think most disagreement comes to. So the way I try to see this is that I kind of begin from the conception of human nature, right? So we see that different from other animals, human beings, they satisfy their necessities, right, by altering the natural world around them through productive activity, what Marx called material production. Material production is the production of material things, and he thinks that we alter nature, we alter also our behavior, right? And also Marx says, and this is mostly taken from the German ideology, by the way, it says that this productive activity is always combined with a mode of cooperation, right? And essentially he thinks that this cooperation that we do to produce is something that transcends the individual, because it's something that we can only do when we are together. So you think of it as a force, this cooperation of us, we come together, produce things together. He thinks of this as a force. We come back to that later on. And then material, as I said earlier, I mean, I hinted at this before, material production has various consequences, right? First of all, the production of the means of subsistence coincide with the production of new surroundings, right? My example earlier, you cut a tree, you make a hut, you are changing nature to create a surrounding that is more convenient for you and for your safety, let's say. And then the production of this new surrounding then shape human behavior and its relationship to nature. Also, the needs themselves evolve along with the material circumstances which human create to satisfy them. So that's the idea that our needs also develop with material production. The more we produce, the more sophisticated our needs become. And there is the idea as well that, of course, you also need, let's say that, you know, today to be warm, you need, in your house, you need gas, let's say. Well, then what that means is that, well, you need, of course, you need warmth. That's your primary need. And the way in which this primary need is achieved in today's society is by having gas. So what that means that you also then have a need for this other thing. And so in some sense, then, you know, in the same way as today I'm talking to you, and because what I need is a computer. So our needs evolve, and we also become the technological development that we create is also part of this need, in the sense that I need the tool that allows me to do those things, right? And so production multiplies our needs and arguably also our capacities, because we can create our capacities multiply in two senses. In one sense, we improve by creating new things, right? By sharing our knowledge, and knowledge is cumulative, so we can always like improve our capacities of creating stuff. But also we learn things by using objects, by consuming objects, right? So let's say, you know, nobody could know how to use a bow and an arrow if the bow and arrow did not exist. So by its own existence, the bow and arrow allow me to have this skill. And so what this is saying is that then those needs, they are multiplied by the creation of those new objects and tools, right? So the more material production evolve, the more human needs evolve along with it. And as I said, also it has the potential, material production also has the potential to multiply human capacities. And I mean, this is a point I made earlier. There is no need for me to go over it. Again, one thing I was going to say about this part is this is a part that is not very discussed often in Marx, because very often the literature tend to emphasize the, if you want, the parts of Marx that are more political, about the class struggle, the domination, the exploitation. But I think there is also this part where Marx basically argues that, look, material production is also something that in a sense is good because it multiplies human capacities and needs, right? It is, if you want, the nicer part of his theory. And so far we've been discussing this in a very abstract way, in very general sense. So arguably, those things that we said so far about human beings, they develop the production and change their needs. This arguably is something that might apply to any kind of period of human activity, right, including its prehistory. However, Marx argued that historic societies, so societies that begin with, with the beginning of writing, right, essentially for Marx, those historic societies are all class societies, right? Those history begins, then you have that distinction between classes, a dominant class and a subordinate class, as we will see. And so in this case, then we have to look at new concepts. Marx arguably introduced those concepts to facilitate the understanding of class societies, so historic societies such as society in which we live today, where for Marx, the dominant class is the capitalist, and the subordinate class is the wage worker, someone that is paid wages by the capitalists. And so here are the first distinctions you have to look at is the productive forces. And this is very straightforward. This is taken actually from G.A. Cohen's book. It's not my original conception. And so here we have the productive forces. What are they? Well, they are the means of production on one hand, which are all the things, all the objects, if you want, that you need to produce. So instruments of production, the tools, the raw materials, the spaces, and then you have labor power. That's also part of this, right? So the power of the laborer, if you want, right? The kind of, you need muscle power. Think about it in this way, right? And so here is the productive forces, and this is quite straightforward. Now things get a bit more complicated when Marx talks about the relations of production. The relations of production. And so what are they? Well, I mean, I think here there is a bit of debate in the literature. Probably some Marxists would not agree with this. But the way I see this is essentially they are social relations determine the power and control asserted by a group over the productive forces. And so basically what relations of production generally point at is this kind of division between two classes. You have one subordinate class that generally performs the work, and then a dominant class, and its dominant class generally does not actually work in the material sense. They are not material producers, but they control the productive forces. So they control the whole process, even though they are not themselves involved with it, right? And as Marx puts it himself, the condition under which definite productive forces can be applied are the conditions of the rule of a definite class of society. And so this is the relations of production essentially try to explain to you this distinction between the dominant and the subordinate class. And so the idea is that also for Marx, under class societies, because the subordinate class, let's say in today's world would be the working class, they do this work, but they don't really decide what's going on in this work. They only are told to do a very small part of it. And so they experience this production as something alien to them, as something whose purpose they might not necessarily grasp. And this is kind of part, if you want, of also the process of alienation, which we can't discuss, but it is connected. And so how does this class, how does this dominant class then assert its power over the subordinate one? And well, Marx is very clear with this. He says that this is done through property, right? And the idea is that, well, there is different circumstances, but let's say in today's world, right, the capitalists are the dominant class because they own the means of production. They own the means to create things. And if you are a wage worker, someone that sells his or her labor power to the capitalist, that is because you lack the means of production. You don't have any other way to survive. You don't have any factory to produce your things and sell them, right? And so what do? You have to sell your labor power to the capitalist, right? So for Marx, in a sense, of course, you're not being forced by the capitalist. The capitalist doesn't come to your house and force you to work in a factory. But for Marx, you are forced by necessity because you lack the means of production. And so that's the only thing you can do, right? And so this is kind of the way. And so for Marx, there is something else going on here. So there is these two classes, and one of them works, and the other one kind of supervises and decides, basically the kind of, if you want, the dominant class controls the raw materials, it owns the necessary tool, right? And also controls the distribution of the products. And so the idea is that if you work today and your wage is not something you have much of a saying on, it's your boss that decides your wage, right? And so the idea for Marx is that there is a conflict of interest between the capitalist, or in general between the dominant and the subordinate class, which for Marx they're different in different periods. So you have the slave and master in the ancient period, then you have the lord and the serf in the feudal period, and then finally the capitalist and the wage worker. And so the idea is that for Marx, this whole process of production under class society also entails what he calls surplus accumulation. And so the idea is that the dominant class makes the subordinate class work more than is necessary for the subordinate class' own existence. And essentially, when it comes to capitalism for Marx, the subordinate class, which is the wage workers, they produce this thing called surplus value. And so the idea that the value produced by the worker exceeds the value paid by the wage. Marx thinks that the value of the wage is the minimum necessary for the worker to survive, and the capitalist always has an interest in pushing towards the minimum. And quite simply, not because the capitalist is evil or anything like that. It is quite simply because the lower the wages, the lower the cost, the higher the profit. So there is this kind of, if you want, conflictual relationship between the capitalist and the worker. And so for Marx, this idea is, if he thinks about this idea that the worker has to work more than he's paid for, he thinks of this as the accumulation or the appropriation of surplus value. And this for Marx is a form of exploitation, right? So that's what Marx, in my view at least, means by exploitation. So exploitation isn't necessarily that, let's say, you treat your worker badly, but any kind of capitalist relation entails this kind of form of exploitation whereby the capitalist must make you work more than he pays you, because if he didn't, then he wouldn't make any profit, right? And so that's this kind of conflict between those two classes, that if the worker, he wants higher wages, but the capitalist doesn't want to give him higher wages, because higher wages means less profit for him, right? And more profit for the capitalist means lower wages for the worker. And so of course, there is a cooperation between them, and the subsistence of the worker depends on the capitalist giving him a job. But there is this kind of conflictual relationship because their material interests, they are opposite in some sense. And so here there is basically if you want, a summary of what I've been saying. So this is also in my PhD and in my book. So it says, material production is necessary because individuals satisfy their needs for it. So that for human beings, we produce things because that's how we satisfy our needs, right? We just don't go around grabbing berries in the forest. We produce stuff. That's what we do. And material production needs cooperation. So cooperation is a necessity of production. And then under class societies, material production should at the same time be understood as a process of surplus appropriation and exploitation. To explain this, we must conceive this process as the unity between the productive forces, which is what we looked at earlier, the labor plus means of production, and the relations of production, relations of property and ownership. And according to my interpretation, at least, these together form the mode of production. And so there is a whole debate with Marxism about, well, there is this whole theory, as we've seen, about the economy as the motor of history. And so some Marxists wonder, well, what is exactly that determines history? Is it the productive forces, or is it the relations of production? And there is kind of a debate between the so-called technological determinist Marxist and the political Marxist. And so the technological determinists say that, well, they think technology and technological development, so the development of the productive forces, is what determines things. And then, of course, the political Marxists argue the opposite. They say that it is class relations, it's the relations of production that determine things, and they are primary in the development of history. I personally, I'm not sure about how, if either of them has a primacy. I just think they do different things fundamentally. That's the way I put it. So the way I put it is that, well, they determine different things. So the development of the productive forces determine what can be produced. So what kind of objects can be produced, right? Of course, you know, you need a certain development of the productive forces to produce an airplane. That's what it means in a nutshell, right? And how it can be produced. So, you know, you can produce the same thing in different ways, and the more technology developed, the more you can make this production easier and cheaper, right? As well as the existence and necessity of corresponding skills, conception, and productive practices. There is this whole idea as well that with this kind of society that we create, with this technology, also our conceptions, our idea develop along with this technology and the productive practices that come along with it. On the other hand, the relations of production, what they do, that determines the form of the model of appropriation. So that the form is kind of the form of surplus, if you want. So the surplus can be taken as a surplus product, it could be surplus labor, or it can be surplus value under capitalism. And we can discuss this later on. If you like, I can explain this a bit better. And so they determine then the mode of appropriation, whether it's coercion or free exchange. Coercion as in, you know, like in slavery, right? You are coercing the person, forcing them to work. Free exchange, I mean, arguably for Marx, they are forced, but they're forced by necessity. They're not forced by the capitalists. And so the rational production determines the forms and the mode of appropriation of surplus by the dominant class through the ownership of the productive forces, as well as the aim of production and the distribution of its products. So the aim of production is also something that is kind of determined by those relations of property, according to Marx. And the idea is that those relationships are practically real and necessary for production, right? So the idea is that if you live under any kind of society that has specific types of relations of production, let's say capital and the wage worker, then those relations become for you practically real and necessary. This is something that you have to deal with, right? Unless you are, you know, extremely rich, you have to kind of deal with this social relations. You have to become a producer. You have to work for the capitalist and sell your labor, right? Because especially as a wage worker, you have no other choice. And so for Marx, there is a conflict between this class that controls the process of production, we are actually taking part in it, and the other class that does all the work. And then from this conflict arise what we might think as a class struggle. And basically class struggle, I think of it as essentially this conflictual relationship. So class struggle for me doesn't mean necessarily strikes, you know, actual class struggle in visible terms, but it's just this idea that there is this conflict of interest between the capitalist and the wage worker. And this can play out in different ways, but it still should be remembered that this exists. And so this kind of production under class societies have various consequences, such as uneven development between the individuals of different classes. So some individuals, they have a lot of resources. The dominant classes, you can use those resources that they get, the surplus they have, to, you know, do whatever they like. They can learn poetry. They have resources to develop their skills, which arguably you don't have if you don't have the resources, right? I mean, you might want to become a philosopher, but if you can't buy philosophy books because you lack the resources, then you arguably cannot develop your philosophical skills. And there's also other consequences, is that there is an unequal time spent working, and uneven consumption among the members of different classes, right? And we're gonna talk a bit about this here. And so those, as I said, those are the general consequences of the material production under class societies. Well, those are the same ones as we said before. So altered nature shapes the environment in which individuals live, and in turn shapes the way in which the individual behaves within the group. Multiple needs and capacities individuals have, although in the case of class society, this is done unevenly, because as I said, some people can, because they have the resources, develop more than others. And then, as I said, there is this conflict between the two classes, and this basically creates, if you want, the conditions, this general inequality for the development of other social conflicts and widespread social problems. So the idea for Marx is that this kind of economic inequality, which are based on this surplus accumulation, can lead to all sorts of other problems, because, you know, inequality and poverty, they create the conditions for, let's say, things such as crime, or it can be drug abuse and things like that. So in a sense, Marx thinks the economy plays a big role in determining the sort of issues that you might have in a certain society, right? And then another point, and this, if you want, is the dialectical part of Marx's method, is this idea that for Marx, the consequences of production are always preconditions for the next cycle of production, which means that, you know, at some point, something is a consequence of something previous, but this consequence is now the starting point from a new cycle. So this is the idea that he sees history kind of as a continuous circular process, right, as a straight line. So every result is also a starting point for a new cycle. It is the starting point for the new production of things, for however you want to put it. That's the kind of idea in a nutshell. And so the way I understand the mode of production is basically as to say that, well, look, first of all, of course, this is for Marx an economic phenomena. It is about how we produce and how our classes relate to each other, and this idea of a surplus. But I argue that for Marx, this is actually also the kind of, if you want, a development in culture. That this kind of material production at the same time is if you want, a development in a specific place, a specific country's culture, let's say. And this is the way in which Marx himself put it. He says, this mode of production must not be considered simply as being the production of the physical existence of individuals. Rather, it is a definite form of activity of those individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. And as individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincide with their production, both with what they produce and how they produce. The nature of individuals thus depend on the material condition that determines their production. And so that's the idea, that the way I see this, because the emphasis here is on how those class relations create, first of all, let's put it this way. First, there is the technological development, right? By developing technology, we alter our skills and we alter our behavior, right? And arguably, this is also a cultural fact, right? In a way, if you think of culture in a very broad terms, as just common behaviors or practices or thoughts that are common within a specific environment, then of course, you know, my behavior at the moment is can only be explained by reference to the technology, right? Because I'm sitting and talking kind of to myself in some sense, right, in front of a strange screen. This kind of behavior is only possible because of a certain technology behind it, right? And then also arguably, also the whole class conflict shapes culture, right? Because it creates different ways of consuming, different class cultures, if you want, right? It creates different fashions for different classes, a different place where different classes go. And then also, arguably, it creates all sorts of other conflicts and inequalities that then arguably also kind of shape the culture of a specific place. Again, unfortunately, I can't. I would like to go on this a bit longer, but I still have a few slides. Hopefully, I'll be able to manage. I think 20 minutes should be enough. And again, I apologize. This is not as developed as it should be. But again, it's because I'm trying to put a lot of material, so I couldn't really go into too much depth. But I'm really happy to answer any questions over this. Okay, so here is another, if you want, implication of Marxism for interdisciplinary research, and this arguably is the relationship between history, economics, and politics. And I see this as being expressed through the so-called base and superstructural metaphor that Marx uses. And here it is what it is about. So it says, in the social production of the existence, men inevitably enter in definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of the material forces of production. The totality of those relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social conscience. Now, I think arguably this is the most controversial notion in the Marxist literature. And that's because, first of all, Marx never explains this at all, hardly ever does. I actually went through a lot of his collected works and typing superstructure everywhere, and there were hardly any it hardly ever talks about it, which is interesting, because if you Google Marxist theory, that's the first thing that comes up, will be the basic superstructure metaphor. It's what a lot of people see as Marx, the kind of center of Marxist theory, the key concept of Marxist theory, even though Marx himself does not explain this. Now, I cannot get into the controversy of what this is about, but generally there is this kind of idea that the base is the economy, and everybody kind of agrees, although we might disagree on the kind of specifics, but there is the base, the economic base is the economy, and well, the superstructure, though, well, nobody really knows what that it really is. And so there have been different accounts of what the superstructure entails, and very often they're very broad. So superstructures become anything, basically anything that is not the economic base. So there would be, you know, ideas, culture, philosophy, politics, whatever you want to put in there is superstructure. Of course, that's a problem because, you know, that is very vague, it's too broad, and then the whole thing might become useful if you see it in this way. The way I see the metaphor, and again, this is my interpretation, and by the way, this is mostly based on Antonio Gramsci's works. I mean, I don't really quote Gramsci because there's not much room, and I wanted to make this as you know, succinct as possible. Those are ideas that I basically more or less took from him. Although he doesn't state it so in this way, let's put it, this reading of the basic superstructural metaphor has been inspired by Antonio Gramsci. And so, to me, what does this mean? Well, this is if you want, the relationship between economic needs and interests, political ideologies, and the state. Okay, so let's give you a very, arguably not very good definition of the Marxist conception of the state. Again, this is very reductionist at this point, but for the purpose of this lecture, this should be good enough. So what is the state for Marx, or for Marxists? Well, it is, of course, something that protects the relations of production, right? Of course, you know, the law protects property. It makes sure that people don't go around just stealing things, because without that, you wouldn't have an economy in the first place. So first of all, the state protects the relations of production, protects property relations, but it also is the mechanism for fulfilling ruling classes' material interests and political interests, right? So the idea is that the ruling classes, which would be under capitalism, the capitalists, right, they use the state as a vehicle to fulfill the material and political interests. And so that's the conception of the state. Then after that, you have, if you want, my definition of ideology, which again, I just have to kind of copy here without really explaining why this is Marxist and whatnot. And so ideology, in my view, has basically three sides. One of them is the so-called social commentary. And so what is it? It's basically explanations or evaluation of social phenomena, of social facts, if you want, of things that are widespread, social problems. We get into more detail in the next slide. Then after the social commentary that explains how the world works, how the social world works, you have the vision of the future, which is a general view of how the future, of a better future that you're imagining, where the problems that you are detecting, let's say, disappear. And then you have the third, which is the means. It is the method by which you bring this vision into reality, right? And now we'll see why those things are relevant. I just want to I mean, I think that the social commentary here is particularly important in my view. So how does this work? Well, basically, what it does is kind of speculative. The way I explain it is some form of speculative thought that is directed at explaining social phenomena in their interconnections. And so the idea by social phenomena, I mean things such as economic and social problems, let's say, crime or unemployment. It can be contradictions, such as the relationship between labor and capital. It can be events, economic crisis or wars. It can be social structures. It can be markets. So any kind of thought that explains those things and relate those things to each other, this is part of the so-called social commentary, right? So it is explanations that deal with social phenomena in their interconnection, if you will, social facts, and how do they relate, right? Now, hopefully this become a bit clear once I get to the next bit. And so how is this done? Well, generally, one social fact is explained by reference to another social fact, or by reference to another group, by reference to a group or even an individual, right? So let's say that there is unemployment in this country, and you can say, well, how do you explain unemployment? What causes unemployment? Well, I mean, there are different views on this. You can say, if you're a Marxist, you believe that unemployment is caused by the relations of production. You think that essentially the capitalist always uses the machines to get more surplus, and then the workers are made redundant. So for the Marxist, unemployment is something inherent in capitalism. It's kind of implicit in its own logics. On the other hand, if you are, let's say, a liberal, then you think that maybe state intervention is causing unemployment. The reason why there is unemployment is because the state is taxing firms too much and nobody is investing. The state is increasing wages too much and nobody's investing because of that, and so on. So as you can see, the same social phenomena can be explained in different ways. Now, the reason why this is important to our general discussion is because what the social commentary does, it creates causal relationships between various social phenomena, arbitrarily or not, right? So this can all be absolutely nonsense. Doesn't need to be true, right? To be a social commentary doesn't need to be a true social commentary. It just has to address those things. It has to explain social facts. And so the idea is that one thing that you can do then is that address the material interest of a specific group, right? Let's say the specific group is the manufacturing workers, and they are having unemployment. There's high levels of unemployment, and all our manufacturing workers are unemployed. Then you can say to the manufacturing workers, well, I think that I know the reasons why you are unemployed. And you can then draw whatever connection you like. You can say that the reason why you're unemployment is because of government mismanagement, or if you are Donald Trump, you would say that it's because of trade with China, or maybe it is because of corruption, maybe it's because of globalization. If you're a conspiracy theorist, you might think it's because of lizard people or whatever. It doesn't matter, but the idea is that what you're doing, you are kind of explaining a set of phenomena and addressing the material interests of a specific group and giving them a reason why they don't have what they want. Right, in this case, job, in the case of unemployment. And so what this means is that in the mind of the individual that accepts this connection, the satisfaction of the material interest is seen as hindered by the social phenomena, which is said to be causing the frustration of said interest, which again is saying, well, look, if you don't have a job, is because of, I don't know, globalization. And then you see globalization as the problem. Why I don't have a job? Well, it's globalization. So globalization becomes the thing, the social phenomena that is hindering your possibility of finding a job, right? And so in this way, then a further interest is also created in the social phenomena itself, right? Now, I didn't care about globalization. I didn't know what globalization was, but I read on the news that it is what is causing me to not have a job. And so now I'm interested. I'm interested in globalization because I can see that as the cause for my problems, right? So this is what I call the transformation of material interest into political interest, is this idea that you can take a material interest, a material problem, and connect it to something else and create this connection. And the person that believes this connection, that believes that essentially to resolve the material problem, you have to resolve this other thing, let's say globalization, or it can be anything. Again, I mean, the answer doesn't need to be true. In fact, very often, the simpler and stranger answers might be the ones that are most believed, right? I mean, in fact, the kind of conspiracy mentality is perhaps if you want, the most appealing, because it's quite simple, right? So, well, why you don't get what you want? Why there is no jobs? Well, because there is a group of people that are evil and want you not to have jobs. It's very appealing because it's very similar to how we feel in everyday life, where everything is a result of someone's motives. And so we apply this reasoning to the social world. Of course, it is absolutely wrong, but again, it's simple to say, well, why don't you have this thing? Well, it's because some group has decided that you shouldn't, right? It's quite straightforward, simplistic way of seeing things. And that's why I think conspiracy theories are popular. I should be able to do this in 10 minutes. Okay, so how does this relate to the base and superstructure? Well, here's the idea. So you have these dominant economic groups, right? They develop an ideology. They develop many ideologies. So remember, dominant groups, they are not all the same. They are all capitalist, perhaps, but each of them has a different view of the world, right? So you shouldn't completely think that, you know, let's say all the capitalists have the complete or exact same point of view, right? They might have things in common, such as that they want to protect capitalism and the market, but there are differences, right? So this kind of theory, the way I put it, is also to understand the differences between the various ideologies propagated by the ruling classes. But so the idea is that the ruling classes, they have the state, right? So the state is there to protect their property, and also to fulfill them, to create more laws that might help them fulfill the material interests. And then also there is the superstructure, for me, also includes this thing that I call ideology, which, as we've seen, includes the social commentary, the vision of the future, and the means to bring this future about. And so, first of all, the relations of production determine the state of this part of the superstructure, to the extent that the state must guarantee basic relations of property. So the state must guarantee that the property relations are respected, as I said earlier. And so the idea is that, how does then the base affect the superstructure? Well, the way I see it is that there is, as we've seen, this kind of class struggle, right, between different groups. And of course, the material conditions can be also determined by other things. I'm not saying that that's the only relevant thing, but let's say that there is this class struggle between groups. There is one group that gets a surplus from another, and then some factories make some workers redundant because they are automatizing all the processes, and now a lot of workers don't lose their jobs. There is all those kind of material conditions that for Marx are determined by this relationship between the two classes, right? The surplus accumulator and the surplus producer, the dominant and the subordinate, the capitalist and the wage worker. And so the idea is that those kind of economic condition that creates the surrounding, they create all those kind of problems, all those kind of inequalities, and those surroundings also shape the interests, the needs and aspirations of different economic groups within the social division of labor. So in every country, you have different people within different industries, and depending on the specific circumstances, some industry are particularly hit by, let's say, an economic recession, or by automatization, or by trade, and all sorts of things like that, right? So you have those kind of economic circumstances. And here it's what happened is that, well, the ruling classes essentially, they obviously want to create ideologies. They have ideologies that reflect their own interests, but they must also gain the consent of various groups. And so the idea is that to gain the consent, to gain, let's say, the votes of other groups, then they must also address their interests. And they do this through what I call ideology. So what they do is that they create a narrative whereby the inequality or interests of various groups are blamed on something. And this, it can be different. There is no one rule on how this is done, but it can be done in many different ways. So you can have, let's say, a proper kind of Keynesian, a Keynesian type of ruling class, and they say, well, look, I do see that those problems come from the market economy, so maybe I bring the state to regulate this, right? So the material interest is addressed by saying that what causes, let's say, unemployment is unregulated markets. But that doesn't need to be, right? So a very common way of doing this, especially in today's world, is by kind of finding a scapegoat, right? So it says, well, why you have unemployment? Well, it's because, let's say, immigrants have come here. It's because of China. It is because of, I don't know, you can even make whatever conspiracy. It's because of the opposite party. The opposite party in the election is the one that is ruining everything. And so the idea is that this ideology is the way by which, if you want, ruling classes express their own interests, but also try to manipulate the interests of different groups, and trying to tell them, look, I know what your problems are. up with a solution. Of course, we don't know whether that's true, whether the solution will work, but that's what they say, essentially, right? And as I say, then those inequalities and all those material problems, then they are seen in different ways. They're interpreted differently, depending on the different ideologies. And so the idea is that the different ideologies then there is, if you want, a struggle between them. It's a struggle mostly, I mean, of course, not only, but to make things easier, let's think of political parties, right? They struggle with each other. They each says, look, this is my true ideology. I can explain those problems better. I can provide the better vision of the future. I can provide the better means to achieve this future. And we don't know. I mean, that's very unpredictable. We never really know exactly who is going to win. And I think one of the reasons why we never know who's going to win between the different competing ideologies is because all those ideologies tend to try to address the needs of workers. And so whether the working classes would go with one narrative or the other is hard to tell. I think I think in my view is absolutely impossible to predetermine. And so the idea is that you have this political structure, and eventually leads to one class being victorious, and this class gets the state power. And now they turn their vision, right? The vision of the future. They try to turn this vision into reality through the establishment of laws and specific policies, right? So those policies in the ideology are the third element, the means, right? But before the party gains power, the party, this is just an idea. It's not real. It's not made into law. It's not made practical, right? But once the party does gain power, then the idea becomes law. It's translated into a law, right? So now what before used to be just a vague idea, now is a proper law that you have to obey, right? So at this point, the state is reacting to the problems of interest developed within the economic base. And arguably, depending on what kind of policy you have, then there is this idea that the superstructure, so the state, might actually change the composition of the base, the kind of division of labor, if you want, within the economy. So you can say, well, now one of the things that the party is going to do is to invest in X industry, right? To kind of deal with the problems for some faction of the working classes. They say, well, let's aim at least solving the problem of this faction. So they're going to invest more, right? And then, in a sense, by doing that, then it's kind of changing the kind of composition, if you want, of the base, in the sense that now there will be more investment in this industry, and arguably then higher levels of employment, right? And then the superstructure, of course, the state supports and protects this change. There is this final bit here that it might not make so much sense, because this is in relation to Gramsci's theory of hegemony, which is also part of this whole kind of whole that I've tried to kind of create, if you want. And this is this idea that then ideologies first have to do with leadership. They have to do with me telling you, look, believe me, I will take you to this perfect world, and everything is going to be solved. Your material interests, I will satisfy them. I will help you creating a better society. Those are just, leadership is, it's not something, it's something that concerns the future, right? And it's done through ideas. You come with me, I'll take you to this new place. But then once the ideas become laws, then leadership becomes domination. In a sense that, now before those ideas were just ideas, now they are laws, so you have to respect it. Now, it is domination in the sense that, in a very, very broad sense, I define the term in sense of an imposition of rules and essentially a process of education that makes you respect those rules, and also supervision and punishment. Those are the way in which I define domination. But then again, let's not get too far into that. So, by the way, one final point, and this is a perfect timing, is that, of course, all the things I've said in this part about, the way in which ideologies and politics address economic interests and translate economic interests and connect them to other things. This is not the case that all ideology or all policy can be reduced to this, right? And so you should not think a priori. You should not think, well, this is the case in every circumstance, but this is more of a framework to discover the link, to discover if there is a link between the material interests of ruling groups and then the way in which ruling groups address the material interests of subordinate groups to persuade them, and how they do them, and what kind of policy does they lead to. And that the policy will then, if you want, react on the base. Okay, I think that's it. I think it's a bit pretty complicated. Hopefully, it made some sense.
Thank you, Andrea, for such a wonderful presentation. From the
Thank you.
cyclical nature of history to the base and superstructure metaphor to the question about leadership and domination. Actually, you have covered a very lot of ground, you know. So we are grateful for this, and the way you are making sense of a very complicated, a slew of issues was really wonderful. So
Thank you.
without wasting time, I would like to throw this session open for questions and comments. And this part of the session will be moderated by my esteemed colleague Shobuj Sharkar. So,
Yeah,
over to you,
here,
Shobuj.
here I am, Amida. And thank you, Professor Andrea Sau, for your enlightening talk. You're really, wonderful. Thank you once again. And I think there is a question for you. This is by Preeti Shah. Let me read it out for you. Marx once commented, if they are Marxist, then I myself am not a Marxist. So my question is, where Marxism stands after Marx, is it true to its nature or changed, altered with time? If changed, is it for good or not? So it's up to you, Andre.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I mean, I really like the idea of Marx, and all I know is that I'm not a Marxist. And I think that's kind of, I mean, I think the reason of that, why Marx said that, it is because what I mentioned at the beginning of the session, right? This idea that the first interpretations of Marx were really reductionist, right? Everything can, there is no politics. Politics is just economics. And Engels and Gramsci later on, they discussed it and says, well, look, this is just becomes a trick for lazy people. They don't want to study history to have a ready answer for everything, right? And so I think that's the sense in which that Marx uses the term. But the question was whether Marxism has changed and whether that's a good thing. That's a hell of a question. I suppose. I mean, Marxism. I think it has developed a lot, and it has developed in different ways. And you see, because there is so much in the method, because as I said, it's holistic. There is so many different sides, and it's really up to each single researcher to find her or his own Marxism, right? And whether it is good, they has changed. Well, I think that it is good, and it should keep developing, especially because I suppose, some of the stuff that Marx says, especially, I mean, not so much, I mean, I think, let's put it this way, I really agree with historical materialism. I think that if you manage to read it in a way that is not deterministic, it is a very good theory. Of course, if you look at the political aspect of Marxism, the kind of stuff that he says you should do, like violent revolution, then, maybe those things are don't really work in today's environment. Perhaps I would say probably the political aspect of Marxism and what he says about communism. I mean, Marx thinks that you shouldn't even think about what communism would be like. You do the revolution and then you decide it. But it's I kind of disagree with kind of that part, right? And also, Marx, I think he was too optimistic about the working classes uniting together. And I think that's not the case. I think working classes, they're very different. And if you want, that's a very, very bourgeois thing for Marx to say, right? Very kind of saying, well, to me, the working classes, they're all the same because they're all wage workers. So they themselves must realize this at some point and then all come together and form an international united working class. And I mean, I do think that, theoretically speaking, it's possible to have a unified working class, but Marx was too optimistic in that sense. So I'll say that we need to, I think, people need to have a serious discussion about what Marx says about communism, and because that really does need to change. In terms of this historic materialism, I think there is a lot of room to just still read what Marx says, and of course try to explain it. But I think there is a lot in it that is very useful, I would say. Okay. I hope this has answered the question to some extent.
Thank you so much. And there is again, I find that another question is from there for you, from Mahenur Khatun. who has a specific question. How, according to Marx, does surplus, just a minute, surplus accumulation lead to self and social alienation among the
Right.
working class people?
Sorry, I couldn't hear the last part. So it leads to social alienation, and then the final question was?
Social alienation among the working class people.
Yes. Right. So is there a question about whether I should explain what this means? Kind of what is this kind of alienation?
Right. Andrea,
yes.
just a minute, Andrea. Actually, as far as I can gather, the question is how, according to Marx, does surplus accumulation lead to self as well as social alienation among the working class people?
Right. Okay. So, I mean, that's a whole. I mean, I know I mentioned that. So there is basically this view that Marx has this theory of alienation, and there is different sides of alienation. I don't know if I remember all of them. I haven't looked into that quite a while ago. But basically, one type of alienation is the alienation from their products. So, and this is specifically if you think about the kind of factory production, right? So if you work in a factory, you are not doing, let's say you're making boxes. You're not doing the whole box, right? Each of you is doing a tiny part. So the first part of the alienation from Marx is the kind of alienation from the product, in the sense that each person is not kind of completely conscious of how the product is done completely, right? They only have this part. Then there is this kind of alienation in the sense that the products that they produce, right, they go somewhere that they never know, so they never know how the labor ends. There is alienation from each other, from the workers, because each has to compete with each other, right? And so this kind of leads to let's say sentiment of cooperation and comradeship that Marx would have wondered. And there are other sides of alienation, and I'm trying to think. So the alienation from the product. I'm afraid I haven't really read much about alienation in lately, so I don't remember the different sides.
It's all right. Yes.
Okay. Fine.
Sorry.
It's okay. So before more questions come to you, I have one question actually. I will be delighted if you please put your lights, ideas on it. Since social media, I'm particularly speaking of Facebook, Twitter, and other social media, and who are actually gradually becoming more powerful, and it's classless. So what will be your approach to it from the angle of historical materialism?
That's an excellent question. Well, I think like the internet kind of, in a sense, of course, it is in line with historical materialism, but it does kind of contradict one of the things that Marx says. So in the German ideology, Marx says that the ideas of the ruling classes are always the ruling ideas of a period of history. And that's simply because the ruling classes, they have the means of production, so they can produce material things, but they also have the means to produce and spread ideas. And so this kind of, for Marx, is kind of a logical conclusion, right? That, well, if let's say I'm not a ruling class, how do I spread my idea? It's not as easy than as if you you own a newspaper, right? And so this is for Marx, this notion that the rulers always produce more and their idea is always dominant. And I mean, arguably, the internet and social media, that has changed it, right? In the sense that now, if you want, we have become, we can all be producers of ideas, and we all have a platform to share them. And whether or not, the extent to, the internet is kind of a crazy avenue, I think. In some sense, of course, I think, it is good for, let's say, socialist movements or human rights or social justice movements, because they can help, they can help spread their views and also organize. But then again, I am not overly optimistic, because I see the dark side of that. The dark side being that, yes, let's say groups that we would like to have more of a platform are getting more of a platform, but there are also other groups that we wouldn't like to become more powerful. And arguably, they can organize better now. They have their own websites. I'm particularly scared of the sharing of conspiracy theories. this is something that's been worrying me a lot, because I think the conspiracy theories eventually lead to high levels of polarization. And arguably, I mean, again, look at something like the Capitol Hill, right? I mean, there you have a situation where a big conspiracy theory not only has, of course, led to polarization, but to, you know, like some serious crime, right? To the kind of destruction of the social order. And so I don't know about, as I said, I mean kind of in two ways. In a way, I see the internet as important and how it can kind of contribute to, let's say, communist and socialist causes, but I am afraid of these new anti-intellectuals, in a sense. I mean, I'm happy that everyone can be an intellectual and can share their views, but the problem is then you have some people that would create all sorts of strange conspiracies, and people might believe those. And then this leads to polarization, and that scares me a lot.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Besides, Andrea, I would like to ask you this question: can social media be completely classless?
Well, that's an interesting point. I don't know. Well, I suppose not completely, right? Because at the end of the day, I mean, we like to think that we own the means of production, and then by owning the means of production, I mean that you own the, you know, your Facebook page, let's say, your Twitter page. But in reality, you don't. It's owned by Twitter. It's owned by Facebook. And again,
that is what I was trying to get at. You know, for example, how Facebook, Twitter, these multinational corporations and these media outlets, how they are actually regulating content in their own ways.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's very interesting lately, right? Because you had, which I don't really understand why they started doing it. But, you know, after the old Trump or Capitol Hill ordeal, they went quite hardcore and said, no, we're going to like start banning websites, right? Extremist websites. But then you look at lots of socialist websites, lots of socialist media and Facebook pages got banned as well, right? So it's like, well, what have they done? And I wonder if, you know, they might use this as an excuse to basically put the Marxists with the fascists and just say that we're all the same, we're all extremists and we have to be banned. So yeah, I mean, that's precisely what I fear, right? That, you know, we think that we have this means of production, that we have our Facebook page, but in reality, those can be taken away from us. And then we might, but again, I suppose we can move to the next, or we might have to create our own social media, maybe the socialist social media. maybe that can be done, right? Maybe a classless social media is not too ambitious.
Okay, so we have more questions right now. So
Sure.
this is quite long question from Nobita Anjum. So let me read it out for you. The key concept of historical materialism is that history evolves through material interest. Is he completely denying the influences of customs, beliefs, religions, and ideologies? But we have seen a lot of wars over ideologies through ages. So how would you explain it through Marxist angle?
Right, no, absolutely. Well, okay, so one of the points that I was trying to make during the lecture is that, well, look, I'm giving you, what I'm giving you for historical materialism is a theory where you can look at the relationship between the economy and other factors, right? However, there is a wrong way to do that, which is to reduce everything. So, I mean, the way to say that, you know, all of history can be reduced to development of economic stuff or economic interests, of course, is wrong, because there is religion, there is those other elements, there is cultural factors, there is geographical factors, there is, you know, natural phenomena, there is floods, you know, there is all sorts of things that are important for historical development. So, you know, I think Marxism should be taken with, you know, you should not go too far with assuming that everything can be just reduced to economic phenomena. It can be related, right? So maybe, let's say there is a religious war, maybe you can look and see whether this religious war has anything to do with the specific material interests that have to be fulfilled. But that doesn't need to be the case, right? So again, Marx would say that yes, you know, the economy is important because, as you said, it determines those relations of classes. It determines the development of our needs and capacities through technology, but that doesn't mean the history can be reduced to that, right? And I don't think a Marxist is necessarily the best method to analyze a specific, let's say, religious conflict or something like that, right? So the way I see it, Marxism is a good framework if applied to certain kind of questions. That doesn't mean that Marxism can explain all the questions, and it shouldn't, because if you try to use Marxism as a theory that explains everything, then it's probably the case that you will not be able to explain everything very well, because again, not everything can be reduced to those economic factors. I mean, in terms of ideology, I do put, I think ideologies have, if you want, their own realm, but they are kind of connected for Marx to economics to some extent. They cannot be reduced to it, but they are connected. So if you think about, the most classical ideology, which is liberalism, Marx says, well, look, liberalism couldn't exist during the feudal period. It couldn't exist until you have the market society, where individuals see themselves as owners of commodities, right? If you have a feudal society, there is no individual, right? The individual is part of a group. You either a noble or you're a serf. That's what you are. You're not an individual with reason. There is no all of this. Those conceptions don't exist. So for Marx, these kind of ideas could only develop with the birth of capitalism, where individuals start see themselves as individual exchanges and producers. And so to him, certain philosophies, if you want, are only possible under certain circumstances. So for Marx, certain philosophies, certain ideologies reflect the practical kind of life of people, right? So that liberalism could only be born after exchange developed, so that individuals started to see themselves as individual producers and exchangers. I hope this. So, I mean, I don't think, again, it should not be reduced, but I think Marx has something to say about ideologies and religion that can be brought down to certain practical material elements. But again, it cannot be completely reduced to that, right? I hope this has kind of answered the question.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Anup Bormon, who has a question like this: can we regard the capitalist system as the source of self-destruction? Andrea.
Right. Well, I would say no, and that's because I mean, obviously, I'm not gonna just say that. I'm gonna explain what I mean. Well, the reason why I say no is because historically, that's the kind of a very old school Marxist view, right? If you want, where which arguably Marx does say that somewhere, the capitalists are digging their own graves, because essentially they are creating these inequalities, they are creating this amount of surplus in their hands and reducing people to poverty, and so this might lead, we would say, to the destruction of capitalism itself. And I don't think that's the case, because I think you need, I mean, I don't think that's also a good way of seeing things, because it might lead you to, I mean, Gramsci talks a lot about this, how this kind of economic determinism leads to inactivity. Well, the idea that you're like, well, look, what's the point for me to engage in politics if anyway the system is going to implode, right? I just wait for the system to implode. It's going to do it on its own. So the idea, I think the system will create some problems and contradictions, and those contradictions and those issues can be used to promote socialism and to lead towards a different kind of society. However, as I try to explain with the basic superstructure part, the same problems can also be used by the most nefarious groups, right? So the moment of crisis isn't just a moment for the socialist. It is also a moment for all sorts of, kind of extremist views, for all sorts of, in Europe can be white supremacists, and people like that, they thrive in those periods because they can go to the worker and says, look, why is that you don't have a job? Well, it is because of, let's say, immigrants. And so why should the worker listen to the Marxist story instead of that? We don't know fundamentally where things are going to swing. So so I think those kind of problems can lead to kind of a new and better society, but they can also, depending on how the war of ideas play out, they can lead to the very opposite of what we want.
So I will request Professor Amit Bhattacharya to take
Some
up
of
the
the session.
participation.
Okay, okay,
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Well, thank you so
Andrea
much,
Sau.
and thank you, Andrea, for being so patient and so insightful.
That's all
Not
right.
only in delivering your lecture, but also in answering to the questions. I was being reminded of what one of the Supreme Court judges in America had to say about the nature of the US Constitution. He had once said somewhere that the United States Constitution is what the Supreme Court makes of it, how it is interpreted by the Supreme Court. So in a way, Marxism is how we interpret it, according to situation, according to situation, because times have changed, the material and intellectual conditions have changed over the years, and that's why, even though it has got holistic ramifications, Marxism as a discursive framework can be open to critiques and criticisms, and that is how an intellectual healthy environment can exist with us and within us. So thank you, Andrea, for bringing to light certain aspects of Marxist thought with us, and for our students and young scholars and researchers. My dear members of the audience, the fun doesn't end here. On the 22nd this month, Debra Ann Castillo from Cornell University is going to talk about an entirely different aspect of this interdisciplinary research. She is going to talk about the necessity and significance of fieldwork in the humanities. So I would like to invite you all to the next session of Parley 2021. But before we sign off, again, I must, on behalf of this audience, thank Andrea for sharing his time with us and certain insights that will give us food for thought in future also. I hope this relationship will endure and we will have to listen to Andrea in future as well. Thank you, Andrea. And with this, we come to the end of this session.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Great pleasure. See you all. Thank you.
Okay. Now,